The guard had seen many things during his nights at the bank, and most of them no longer troubled him. London, after midnight, had its own rhythm, one that did not belong to the daylight world, and over time he had learned to accept its peculiarities without question. There were always distant footsteps where no one could be seen, shadows that lingered longer than they should, and figures that seemed uncertain at the edges, as though the fog itself had taken shape for a moment before dissolving again. None of that had ever unsettled him in any lasting way. What he could not grow accustomed to was her. He noticed the woman for the first time a little after 2 in the morning, when the street had already fallen into that quiet, suspended stillness that comes only in the deepest part of the night. She stood at the far end of the road, where the fog gathered more thickly than elsewhere, forming a pale, shifting curtain that concealed as much as it revealed. At first, he assumed she was simply waiting, perhaps for someone delayed or for a carriage that had not yet arrived, and he paid her no particular attention. Then she began to walk. Her pace was steady and unhurried, yet there was something deliberate in the way she moved, as though each step had been measured long before she took it. She kept to the opposite side of the street, maintaining a distance that never seemed to change, no matter how long he watched. The black of her dress was deeper than the surrounding night, absorbing the faint glow of the gas lamps rather than reflecting it, and her figure remained strangely indistinct, as though the fog preferred to gather around her instead of drifting past. He tried more than once to see her face clearly, but the effort led nowhere. It was not simply a matter of shadow or poor light. The impression he had was that of a face that should have been visible, yet refused to become so, leaving only the uneasy sense of something present and just out of reach. She passed the bank without slowing and without so much as turning her head in his direction. There was no acknowledgement, no hesitation, and no sign that she had even noticed him standing at the gate. She continued forward with the same measured calm until the fog closed around her, and within a few seconds there was nothing left to see but the empty street. The guard remained where he was, listening more carefully than he intended. For a brief moment, he thought he could still hear her footsteps, faint and distant, though he could not say from which direction they came. When even that sound faded, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, as though something had passed through the street and left it altered in a way he could not quite define. By morning, he had nearly persuaded himself that the entire encounter had been a simple trick of light and fatigue, the kind that comes easily during long hours of solitary watch. It was an explanation that satisfied him well enough to set the matter aside, and he carried on with his duties without giving it further thought. That certainty lasted only until the following night. At the same hour, under the same dim glow of the lamps, the woman appeared again at the far end of the street. She stood in almost the exact place he remembered, framed by the same dense fog, and after a short while she began to walk in precisely the same manner as before. There was no variation in her pace, no change in her direction, and no sign that she had any purpose beyond the simple act of passing through. When she returned on the third night, unchanged in every detail he could observe, his unease began to give way to a quieter, more persistent feeling that he found difficult to ignore. It was not fear in the usual sense, but something closer to a steady pressure on his thoughts, a suggestion that what he was witnessing required an explanation he did not yet have. So when she emerged once more from the fog, as though stepping out of it rather than walking through it, he made a decision that seemed, in the moment, entirely reasonable. He left his post and followed her. At first, everything appeared ordinary. He crossed the street, noting the sound of his own footsteps against the damp stone and the familiar chill of the night air settling more sharply around him. The distance between them remained constant, no matter how carefully he adjusted his pace, and although he expected her to react in some way, she gave no indication that she was aware of him. As they moved further from the bank, the fog thickened, and the lamps behind him began to lose their clarity, their light reduced to faint, blurred shapes that offered little comfort. The sounds of the street seemed to recede as well, leaving only the quiet rhythm of his own steps and the soft, almost imagined echo of hers somewhere ahead. It was at this point that his memory failed him. He would later recall the beginning of the pursuit with surprising clarity, but everything that followed dissolved into a blank space he could not fill, no matter how carefully he tried to reconstruct it. There was no clear moment where he turned back, no distinct point at which the woman disappeared, and no sense of how much time had passed between leaving the bank and returning to it. When he finally found himself again at the gate, the fog had begun to lift, and the street looked as it always did in the early hours before dawn. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that whatever had happened beyond the reach of the lamps had been no more than a confusion of fatigue and imagination. That belief did not last. The door to the bank stood open. There were no signs of force, no broken lock, and no damage to the frame. It was simply open in a way that should not have been possible under any ordinary circumstance. And inside, in the stillness that followed, it became clear that something was missing. By the time Detective Blackwood arrived at the bank, the first light of morning had already begun to settle over the street, softening the sharp edges left behind by the night. What had seemed uncertain and distorted in the fog now appeared ordinary, almost unwilling to admit that anything unusual had taken place there at all. London had a way of restoring its composure with the dawn, as though the city itself preferred not to linger on what occurred in its darker hours. A small crowd had gathered at a careful distance from the entrance, held back more by quiet instruction than by force. Those present did not speak loudly, yet their attention was fixed on the building with a kind of restrained curiosity, the sort that emerges when something has gone wrong but has not yet been fully understood. 2 constables remained near the door, their posture suggesting a matter already contained, if not entirely resolved. From the outside, the bank gave little away. The door had been closed again, and at a passing glance it might have seemed undisturbed. Only upon closer inspection did a subtle irregularity become apparent, a slight misalignment in the frame that hinted at recent use without proper care. It was not damage in the usual sense, but it suggested that something had been opened and shut under circumstances that did not allow for precision. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter still, though the tension had not lessened. The staff moved with a deliberate restraint, as though uncertain of where to place their attention. One man remained near the far wall, his manner controlled yet strained, while another attempted to review documents that did not seem to yield clear answers. At the center of the room, set apart without being formally isolated, sat the night guard. He appeared composed at first glance, though the stillness he maintained carried a different quality from calm. His posture was rigid, his hands resting in place with a kind of careful intention, as though he were holding himself steady rather than simply sitting at ease. There were small details in his appearance that spoke of disruption, subtle enough to escape notice unless one looked with purpose. A misplaced button, a crease where none should have formed, a faint mark on his sleeve that had not yet been addressed. None of it served as evidence on its own, yet together they suggested that the night had not passed as routinely as it should have. It was already understood, at least by those first on the scene, that the explanation lay close at hand. The guard had been alone. The vault had been opened without force. The keys had been found in his possession, though not where they were meant to be secured. From such details, a conclusion had formed quickly, and it had required little adjustment since. Yet the matter of what had been taken remained less certain. The ledgers had not yet yielded a final account, and while there were clear discrepancies, they had not been fully reconciled. It was known that something was missing, though not precisely what, and that uncertainty lingered in contrast to the confidence with which blame had already been assigned. Blackwood's attention settled not on the gathered officials, nor on the documents that passed between them, but on the guard himself. There was no urgency in his observation, only a quiet, deliberate consideration, as though the truth of the matter might be found not in what had been declared, but in what had yet to be understood. The account given by the guard did not align with the simplicity of the accusation. He did not deny leaving his post, nor did he attempt to conceal the gap in his memory. What he described, however, introduced a detail that did not belong within the explanation already accepted by others. A woman had appeared on the street during his watch, not once, but repeatedly, and always under the same conditions. The consistency of her presence had unsettled him, though not in a way he could easily justify. She had been seen at the same hour each night, emerging from the densest part of the fog and moving along the same path with a steady, measured pace. There had been no variation in her behavior, no acknowledgement of his presence, and no indication that she was aware of being observed. The distance between them had remained constant, and despite his efforts, he had never been able to see her face clearly. It was not obscured in any ordinary sense, but rather seemed to resist clarity altogether, leaving only the impression of a figure where detail should have been. On the third night, the repetition had become too precise to ignore. What had first seemed incidental began to suggest intention, and that suggestion, once formed, proved difficult to dismiss. The decision to follow had not been made in haste, but had instead arisen from a quiet conviction that something required explanation. It was at this point that the account lost its continuity. The guard retained a clear memory of leaving his position and crossing the street, of the air growing colder as he moved away from the bank, and of the fog becoming thicker with each step. Beyond that, there was nothing he could recall with certainty. The sequence of events that followed did not present itself as confusion or distortion, but as absence, as though a portion of time had simply been removed. When he became aware of his surroundings again, he was once more at the entrance to the bank. The fog had begun to lift, and the street had returned to its usual appearance. There had been no immediate sense that anything had occurred, no visible sign that the order of the night had been disrupted. That impression did not hold. The door stood open in a manner that could not be easily explained. There were no marks of forced entry, no damage to the lock, and no indication that the mechanism had been tampered with. It had been opened as it was meant to be opened, and then left without being properly secured. Within, the vault had been accessed with the same precision. Taken together, these details formed a sequence that appeared complete to those inclined towards simple conclusions. A guard had abandoned his post, the keys had been used, and the bank had been entered without resistance. What remained unclear, however, was not merely the gap in memory, but the presence of a pattern that did not belong within such an explanation. Blackwood did not concern himself with what had already been decided. Instead, his attention rested on what repeated without variation, on what appeared only under specific conditions, and on what required a witness in order to exist at all. And in that, there was already the beginning of something that had not yet been properly seen. The interior of the vault revealed far less than one might have expected, and yet it was precisely this absence of disorder that held Blackwood's attention longer than any obvious sign of intrusion could have done. There were no scattered documents, no hurried traces of movement, and no indication that the contents had been disturbed in haste. Whatever had been taken from within had been removed with care, and perhaps more importantly, with time. The heavy door itself bore no marks of force. Its mechanism, though complex, had been engaged properly, each internal component responding as it had been designed to do. The lock had not been bypassed, nor had it been tampered with in any crude or experimental way. It had simply been opened, and later closed again, with a precision that suggested familiarity rather than desperation. The ledgers, arranged on a nearby desk, told a less complete story. Their entries were consistent at first glance, yet there were small irregularities that resisted immediate explanation. Certain amounts appeared where they should not have been, while others seemed to exist only in expectation, recorded in advance but not fully accounted for in the present. It was not a matter of obvious falsification, but rather a subtle misalignment between what had been written and what remained. Such discrepancies might have been dismissed under different circumstances, attributed to oversight or routine error. Here, however, they acquired a different significance. The absence of force, combined with the uncertainty of what had been taken, suggested that the act itself had been constructed to appear simpler than it truly was. Blackwood's attention moved from the vault to the surrounding space, tracing the path that would have been required to enter and leave without attracting notice. The floors were undisturbed, the surfaces free of any clear indication that more than one person had been present. There were no misplaced objects, no signs of hesitation or reconsideration, and no evidence of conflict. Everything remained in its place, as though the night had passed without interruption. And yet, something had been removed. The question, then, was not how entry had been gained, but how it had been made to appear as though no effort had been required at all. Beyond the vault, the main hall offered little in the way of contradiction. The arrangement of desks and counters remained unchanged, and the narrow passages between them showed no sign of unusual movement. The lamps, now dim in the growing daylight, revealed only the expected wear of regular use. If there had been more than one person present during the night, they had moved with an awareness that left no trace behind. This absence of evidence extended, in a quieter way, to the guard himself. His account, though incomplete, did not carry the inconsistencies often found in deliberate invention. The portions he could recall remained stable under examination, neither expanding nor shifting when reconsidered. The gap in his memory, rather than appearing as an attempt to conceal, presented itself as a fixed boundary beyond which nothing could be retrieved. It was this boundary that held the greater interest. A man who intended deception might obscure details, alter sequences, or introduce uncertainty where clarity would be expected. Here, the pattern was reversed. The known events remained consistent, while the unknown portion resisted all attempts at reconstruction. It was not confusion, but absence, and it suggested interference of a different kind. Blackwood considered the position of the keys, both as they should have been secured and as they had been found. Their relocation, though minor in appearance, required intention. They had not been lost or misplaced in the usual sense, but had been transferred from one position to another with enough care to avoid immediate notice. This implied that, at some point during the night, the guard had acted with purpose, even if that purpose no longer remained within his memory. The possibility that he had done so willingly did not align with the rest of the arrangement. If the guard had intended to open the vault, there would have been no reason to introduce the element of the woman, nor to maintain the repetition of her appearances over several nights. Such a detail did not simplify the explanation. It complicated it unnecessarily. It introduced a pattern that required observation, and therefore a witness, and it relied on consistency rather than concealment. This suggested preparation. The repetition of the woman's presence had not been incidental. It had established expectation, drawing the guard's attention gradually rather than forcing it all at once. By the third night, the act of following had not been an impulsive decision, but the natural result of a pattern that had been carefully maintained. What had appeared as curiosity may, in fact, have been the final step in a sequence designed to produce exactly that response. If so, then the moment of absence, the portion of time that could not be recalled, was not a failure of memory, but the intended outcome. Blackwood's gaze returned briefly to the vault, not to the door itself, but to the space around it, as though measuring what could have occurred in silence. The removal of the contents had required access, but it had also required assurance that no interruption would occur. Such assurance could not be obtained through chance alone. It required control, not of the building nor of the mechanism, but of the man who stood between them. And if that control had been achieved without leaving visible trace, then whatever had been used to obtain it had been applied with care equal to that shown within the vault itself. The matter, then, was no longer one of entry, but of influence. Something had guided the guard away from his post, not by force, but by design. Something had ensured that he would act in a manner that appeared voluntary, while removing from him the ability to recall what had taken place. In such a case, the woman was not an anomaly to be dismissed, but a necessary element of the structure. She had not simply passed through the street. She had been placed within it, and she had been seen only by the one man who needed to see her. The street outside the bank revealed nothing unusual at first glance, and it was precisely this absence of irregularity that required closer attention. In daylight, the distance between the entrance and the far end of the road appeared shorter than it had seemed during the night, and the fog that had once concealed its details had thinned into nothing more than a faint residue along the edges of the buildings. What had been uncertain a few hours earlier now stood plainly in view, as though the city had resumed its ordinary character without hesitation. Blackwood did not rely on this appearance. He moved slowly along the path described by the guard, not in haste, but with the measured patience of someone reconstructing an event that had already concluded. Each step was considered in relation to what had been observed the previous night, though no direct trace remained to confirm it. The stone beneath his feet was dry in places and darkened in others, bearing the marks of routine passage rather than anything distinct or recent. From the position of the bank entrance, the far end of the street remained clearly visible. There were no obstructions that would have concealed a figure standing there, nor any architectural features that would have altered the line of sight. During the day, it was impossible to imagine how a person could appear and disappear without being noticed by others nearby. The openness of the space worked against such a possibility, reducing it to something that seemed improbable when removed from the conditions of the night. Yet those conditions had been essential. The fog, as it had gathered in the early hours, did not settle evenly across the street. It accumulated more densely at one end, forming a natural boundary beyond which visibility diminished rapidly. This concentration was not unusual for London, though it varied from night to night depending on the air and the movement of the wind. What mattered was not the presence of the fog itself, but the consistency with which it had appeared in the same place during the guard's watch. That consistency suggested that the location had not been chosen at random. Blackwood paused near the point where the guard had first noticed the woman, allowing his attention to settle on the surrounding buildings. Their windows overlooked the street at regular intervals, each providing a clear vantage from above. During the night, at least some of those windows would have been occupied, whether by those returning late or rising early. And yet, no one else had reported seeing the figure. This absence of corroboration did not weaken the account. Instead, it refined it. If the woman had been visible only from a specific position, then her appearance must have depended on that position being occupied. From elsewhere, she may have been obscured or simply indistinct enough to pass without notice. The distance maintained between her and the guard would have ensured that she remained within his view while avoiding the clarity that closer proximity might have provided. It was not merely that she had been seen. It was that she had been seen in a particular way. Blackwood continued along the street, following the path the guard had taken on the third night. The further he moved from the bank, the more the environment began to shift in subtle ways. The buildings grew slightly closer together, the angle of the street narrowing just enough to alter the movement of air between them. It was here that the fog would have thickened most noticeably, drawn into a slower current that lingered rather than dispersing. In such conditions, sound behaved differently. Footsteps would have carried unevenly, sometimes amplified, sometimes absorbed entirely. The absence of other noise would have made even the faintest echo seem distinct, though not always reliable in its direction. A person moving ahead might have appeared closer or further away than they truly were, their presence suggested as much by expectation as by sight. The guard's account of distance, then, required reconsideration. What had seemed constant may not have been so in reality. The figure ahead could have adjusted her pace without appearing to do so, maintaining the illusion of separation while guiding the movement behind her. Such control did not require speed, only precision, and an understanding of how perception altered under those conditions. Blackwood stopped at a point where the street curved almost imperceptibly, just enough to break the line of sight with the bank. From here, the entrance was no longer visible, and the sense of orientation began to shift. Without a fixed reference, it would have been easy to lose track of direction, especially in the presence of dense fog and minimal light. This, too, was not accidental. The place where the guard's memory failed corresponded not with distance, but with position. It marked the transition between the familiar and the uncertain, between a space that could be observed and one that could be shaped. If the intention had been to lead him away, then this was where it would have been accomplished. Blackwood remained there for a time, considering the alignment of the buildings, the movement of air, and the quiet geometry of the street itself. There was nothing remarkable in any single detail, yet together they formed an environment that could be used if one understood it well enough. The question, then, was not whether the woman had been seen by others, but whether she had been meant to be seen by them at all. Her appearances had been limited not only by time, but by perspective. She had existed within a narrow range of observation, defined by distance, light, and expectation. Outside of that range, she may have been indistinguishable from the fog itself, or from any other passerby who did not draw attention. This suggested intention of a different kind. She had not been placed in the street as a general distraction, but as a specific one. Her purpose had not been to be noticed, but to be followed. And that purpose had required a single observer, positioned exactly where he had been, at the precise hour when the conditions would support the illusion. Blackwood turned back toward the bank, retracing his steps with the same measured pace. The street, now fully revealed by daylight, offered no resistance to his understanding, yet it confirmed something that had not been visible before. What had taken place there during the night had not depended on concealment alone. It had depended on design. And design, once recognized, could be followed back to its source. If the events of the night had been arranged with intention, then that intention must have begun long before the guard ever stepped away from his post. The repetition alone suggested preparation, and preparation required knowledge. Not only of the place, but of the man assigned to watch over it. Blackwood's attention turned, therefore, not to the crime itself, but to the conditions that had made it possible. The guard's schedule, though ordinary in appearance, was not entirely without pattern. His shifts followed a regular rotation, yet within that rotation there were consistencies that could be observed by anyone with reason to do so. He was known to keep to his post with unusual diligence, rarely leaving his position unless required, and even then only for brief and necessary intervals. Such reliability, while commendable, also made him predictable. Predictability, in this case, may have served as the foundation upon which the entire sequence had been constructed. The woman's appearances had not been scattered across different nights or times. They had occurred under identical conditions, each instance reinforcing the one before it. This was not chance, but sustained attention. Someone had been watching the guard long enough to understand not only his movements, but his habits, his patience, and the limits of his restraint. It was not enough to know where he would be. It had been necessary to know how he would respond. The decision to follow had not been forced upon him in a single moment. It had been cultivated, shaped gradually through repetition until it appeared to arise from his own reasoning. What seemed, on the surface, like curiosity may have been the final stage of a process that began the first time he noticed the figure in the fog. This implied proximity. Whoever had arranged it had either observed the bank directly or had access to information detailed enough to serve the same purpose. The question, then, was not simply who had the opportunity to act, but who had the means to study without attracting attention. Blackwood considered the individuals connected to the bank in terms of access. Employees, clerks, messengers, and those whose duties required regular presence within or around the building all occupied positions that could provide insight into the routines of the place. Their movements would not have been questioned, and their familiarity with the structure would have reduced the need for guesswork. Yet familiarity alone did not account for the precision observed. The vault had been opened without hesitation, and its contents had been removed without disorder. This required not only knowledge of the mechanism, but confidence in its use. Such confidence was rarely acquired without experience, and experience of that kind was not widely distributed. At the same time, the absence of visible coordination within the building suggested that whatever had been done had not required multiple individuals to move freely inside. If more than one person had been involved, their roles had been defined in advance, their movements limited to what was necessary. This led to a quieter consideration. The guard had not been overcome by force, nor confronted directly. His removal from the entrance had been achieved through suggestion, through a pattern that encouraged action rather than demanded it. This indicated an understanding that extended beyond the mechanical aspects of the crime. It suggested that the planners had accounted for the mind as carefully as they had accounted for the lock. If the guard's response had been anticipated, then it must have been based on observation of his previous behavior. Not merely where he stood or how long he remained, but how he reacted to irregularity, how long he tolerated uncertainty before seeking explanation, and what degree of repetition would be required to transform unease into action. Such knowledge was not easily obtained from a distance. It required either prolonged observation or prior acquaintance, and the distinction between the two was not insignificant. Observation could be conducted without interaction, provided one remained unnoticed. Acquaintance implied contact, even if only in passing. A familiar face, a routine exchange, or a presence so ordinary that it ceased to be remarked upon could provide the same access with less effort. Blackwood considered both possibilities without favoring either. The bank itself offered several points from which such observation might have been conducted. Nearby buildings overlooked the street at angles sufficient to track movement without drawing attention, while the flow of pedestrians during the day provided cover for those who might pass repeatedly without being remembered. Even at night, there were moments when the street was not entirely empty, though those moments were brief. Still, the repetition of the woman's appearances suggested a different approach. Her presence had been too consistent, too precisely timed to rely on chance concealment. She had appeared only when the guard was present to see her, and only under conditions that favored ambiguity. This required coordination with timing and with the guard's watch. It also required confidence that the pattern would not be interrupted. Such confidence might arise from familiarity with the bank's operations or from knowledge of its staffing. If the guard's presence during those nights had been expected rather than assumed, then the range of possible explanations narrowed accordingly. Blackwood returned his attention to the building itself, considering the flow of activity that passed through it on an ordinary day. Deliveries, visitors, internal movement, and quiet exchanges all contributed to a rhythm that, while predictable to those within it, might appear complex to an outsider. Within that rhythm, however, there were fixed points. Certain individuals arrived at consistent hours, performed defined tasks, and departed without variation. Their roles, though unremarkable, provided continuity, and with continuity came the opportunity to observe without being questioned. If one wished to study the guard without drawing attention, it would not be necessary to stand and watch openly. It would be enough to belong. This realization did not yet identify a specific individual, nor did it exclude involvement from outside the bank. It did, however, establish a condition that any explanation would need to satisfy. The events of the night had not been spontaneous. They had been prepared, and that preparation had begun in a place where observation was possible without suspicion, where routine concealed intention, and where a man could be studied long enough to be guided without ever realizing that he had been. Blackwood did not yet know who had done this, but he no longer believed that the answer lay in the night alone. It lay, instead, in the days that had come before it. The days preceding the incident began to take on a different significance once considered in light of preparation rather than coincidence. What had first appeared as an isolated event now suggested a sequence that extended backward, shaped quietly over time and concealed within the ordinary routine of the bank. Blackwood's attention turned to the records not for their numerical accuracy alone, but for the patterns they might reveal when viewed as part of a larger structure. The discrepancies within the ledgers had already indicated that something had been altered, though not in a manner that immediately exposed itself as theft. The entries did not contradict one another outright. Instead, they aligned too carefully in certain places, as though adjusted to preserve balance while concealing a gradual shift. This kind of adjustment required patience. It could not have been achieved in a single night, nor without access to the records themselves. Each alteration, however small, would have needed to pass unnoticed among legitimate entries, blending into the expected flow of transactions without drawing attention. Over time, such changes might accumulate into something significant while remaining indistinct when examined in isolation. The result was not the sudden absence of a sum, but the quiet erosion of certainty regarding what had been present to begin with. This observation introduced a new possibility. The vault may not have been emptied in the conventional sense. What had been removed physically during the night could represent only a portion of what had already been obscured within the records. If so, then the act of opening the vault had not been the beginning of the theft, but its conclusion. The importance of this distinction lay in its implication. If the greater part of the loss had been prepared in advance, then the final act required only access, not improvisation. The risk associated with forced entry had been avoided not through skill alone, but through the decision to eliminate the need for it entirely. This brought the matter of access into sharper focus. The ledgers were not available to everyone. Their handling was limited to those whose duties required it, and while oversight existed, it relied heavily on the assumption of accuracy rather than constant verification. Those who worked with the records did so within a system that trusted consistency, and that trust, if misused carefully enough, could be turned into concealment. Blackwood considered the individuals whose roles placed them in proximity to such information. Their positions differed in responsibility, but they shared a common advantage. They operated within the routine of the bank, their presence expected and their actions seldom questioned so long as they remained within the bounds of that routine. It was within this expectation that alteration could occur without notice. The repetition of the woman's appearances now seemed less like an isolated tactic and more like the visible edge of a larger design. While attention had been drawn to the street and to the guard, the groundwork for the crime had been laid elsewhere, in a place where numbers could be adjusted without immediate consequence and where time allowed for gradual change. The guard, then, had not been the primary obstacle. He had been the final one. His removal from the entrance had not been an act of convenience, but of necessity. Without it, the final step could not be completed without risk. With it, the transition from preparation to execution became almost seamless, the opening of the vault appearing as the central act when, in truth, it had merely revealed what had already been set in motion. This interpretation altered the nature of the investigation. The question was no longer limited to who had been present during the night, but extended to who had been present during the days and weeks before it. The focus shifted from opportunity in a single moment to opportunity sustained over time, from access gained briefly to access maintained without interruption. Such continuity narrowed the field without reducing it entirely. Among those connected to the bank, there were individuals whose roles provided both proximity and duration. Their work required regular interaction with records, with keys, or with the physical structure of the building itself. None of these factors alone established involvement, yet together they defined the conditions under which involvement could occur. Blackwood did not yet assign suspicion to any one person. Instead, he observed the alignment of circumstances. The consistency of the guard's schedule, the precision of the woman's appearances, the absence of force at the vault, and the irregularities within the ledgers all pointed toward a single conclusion. The event had been designed to appear simple while resting upon a foundation that was anything but. The visible portion of the crime had been limited to a single night. Its origin, however, lay elsewhere. And if that origin could be identified, then the structure built upon it might begin to reveal the hand that had shaped it. The narrowing of possibilities did not occur through sudden revelation, but through the quiet elimination of what could no longer be sustained under closer examination. Each role within the bank carried with it a set of responsibilities, and within those responsibilities lay the limits of what could be done without drawing attention. Blackwood did not begin with suspicion directed at individuals, but with the structure itself. From that structure, certain positions emerged as more closely aligned with the conditions already established. Those who handled the ledgers, those who had knowledge of the vault's mechanism, and those whose presence extended across multiple areas of the bank formed the natural points of consideration. Among them, the clerks responsible for maintaining the records appeared, at first, to hold the most immediate relevance. Their work required precision, repetition, and familiarity with the flow of transactions. They operated within the system that had shown signs of subtle alteration, and their proximity to the ledgers placed them in a position where gradual change could occur without interruption. Over time, even minor adjustments could accumulate into discrepancies that were difficult to isolate, especially when each entry, viewed independently, remained within the bounds of expectation. It would have been a simple conclusion to draw. Yet simplicity, in this case, required caution. The alterations observed within the records did not suggest haste, nor did they reflect the kind of inconsistency that often accompanies deliberate falsification. They were measured, restrained, and aligned in such a way that they preserved the appearance of balance. This level of control implied not only access, but a broader understanding of how the system would be reviewed and what degree of variation would pass without question. Such understanding was not limited to those who recorded the numbers. It extended to those who oversaw them. Blackwood allowed his attention to shift beyond the clerks, considering instead the structure of oversight that governed their work. The presence of supervision introduced an additional layer, one that could either prevent or conceal irregularity depending on how it was applied. If the discrepancies had remained unnoticed, it was not solely because they had been introduced carefully, but because they had not been challenged at the point where challenge was expected. This introduced a quieter possibility. The records may not have been altered in isolation. If those responsible for maintaining them had acted alone, they would have done so under the risk of review. Each entry would have been subject to scrutiny, however routine, and any inconsistency, once detected, could have led to further examination. The persistence of the discrepancies suggested that either the review had been insufficient or that it had been guided away from the very details that required attention. In either case, the focus could not remain solely on those who wrote the entries. It had to include those who confirmed them. This did not yet establish involvement, but it shifted the direction of inquiry. The clerks, when considered within this broader context, appeared less as originators and more as conduits through which the system operated. Their role allowed for alteration, but not necessarily for its protection. Without that protection, the gradual change observed within the ledgers would have risked exposure long before it reached significance. The question, then, was not simply who could alter the records, but who could ensure that such alterations remained unexamined. Blackwood returned, in thought, to the sequence of the crime as it had unfolded during the night. The opening of the vault, the absence of force, and the controlled removal of its contents all pointed toward a level of confidence that extended beyond technical skill. It suggested certainty not only in execution, but in the conditions surrounding it. Such certainty required more than knowledge of the mechanism. It required assurance that no immediate contradiction would arise. If the ledgers, once examined, had revealed a clear and undeniable loss, the act would have drawn immediate and focused attention. Instead, the uncertainty within the records created hesitation, delaying the formation of a complete account and allowing the visible act of the crime to appear more central than it truly was. This delay was not incidental. It had been built into the structure of the event. Blackwood considered the implications of this arrangement not as a collection of separate actions, but as a unified design. The woman in the street, the absence in the guard's memory, the condition of the vault, and the state of the ledgers all aligned toward a single effect. Each element supported the others, reducing the likelihood that any one part, taken alone, would reveal the full extent of what had been done. Within such a design, the role of the clerks, though relevant, appeared insufficient to account for the whole. Their position explained access, but not coordination. It allowed for change, but not for the assurance that such change would remain concealed at the moment when concealment mattered most. This realization did not remove them from consideration entirely. It altered their place within it. Rather than standing at the center of the event, they occupied a position nearer its edge, connected to the mechanism but not necessarily responsible for its direction. Their involvement, if it existed at all, would likely be limited to what had passed through their hands without recognition, rather than what had been shaped by intention. Blackwood allowed this possibility to settle before moving beyond it. The investigation, having approached one conclusion, now turned away from it with equal care. What remained was not the absence of direction, but a refinement of it. The structure of the crime demanded a level of oversight, of timing, and of control that extended beyond the roles already considered. And within that extension lay the next step. Not in the hands that recorded the numbers, but in the authority that allowed those numbers to remain unquestioned. The movement away from the clerks did not disperse suspicion, but rather concentrated it in a narrower and more defined direction. If the alterations within the ledgers had required protection, then that protection must have come from a point where scrutiny could be softened, delayed, or redirected without raising concern. Within the structure of the bank, such influence was not widely distributed. Authority, even in its quieter forms, carried with it the ability to shape attention. It determined which details were considered urgent and which could be postponed, which inconsistencies demanded resolution and which could be attributed to routine irregularity. This influence did not need to be exercised openly in order to be effective. It could exist as an expectation, a habit of trust that guided others without requiring instruction. Blackwood considered the roles within the bank that operated at this level. They were not numerous, but they were central. Those who oversaw the flow of transactions, who verified the records, and who maintained awareness of both the financial and operational aspects of the institution occupied positions that extended beyond individual tasks. Their responsibility connected the separate functions of the bank into a single, coherent system. Such positions provided more than access. They provided perspective. From that perspective, patterns that would remain invisible to others could be observed, adjusted, or concealed as necessary. The gradual shift within the ledgers, subtle enough to pass unnoticed by those who recorded the entries, would have been far more apparent to someone whose role required periodic review of the whole. That it had not been corrected suggested one of two possibilities. Either the irregularities had been judged insignificant, or they had not been judged at all. The distinction, though slight in appearance, carried weight. To overlook an inconsistency was one matter. To ensure that it remained unexamined was another entirely. Blackwood allowed this distinction to guide his attention toward the manner in which oversight had been exercised in the days leading up to the incident. The ledgers had not been left unattended, nor had they existed outside the structure of review. Yet the discrepancies within them had persisted, accumulating without interruption until they formed part of a larger pattern. This persistence implied continuity. It suggested that the same conditions had been maintained over time, that whatever had allowed the alterations to pass without correction had not been a momentary lapse, but a sustained state. Such stability did not arise from chance. It required consistency in those responsible for maintaining it. At the same time, the matter of the guard's schedule re-entered consideration. His presence during the nights in question had not been incidental. The repetition of the woman's appearances had aligned precisely with his watch, and that alignment required knowledge not only of his habits, but of his assigned hours. Such information was not secret, but neither was it entirely public. It circulated within the routine of the bank, among those whose duties required awareness of staffing and security. This introduced an overlap. The knowledge of the guard's schedule and the capacity to influence the review of records did not belong equally to all within the institution. Where they intersected, the field of possibility narrowed further. Blackwood's attention settled on this intersection, not as a point of conclusion, but as a point of convergence. It brought together the elements that had, until now, been considered separately. The preparation within the ledgers, the precision of the final act, and the timing of the guard's removal all depended on a level of coordination that could not be sustained without oversight. Coordination, in this sense, did not require constant direction. It required alignment. Each part of the sequence had been arranged to occur under conditions that supported it. The alterations within the records reduced the clarity of what would later be found missing. The appearances of the woman established a pattern that guided the guard's behavior. The opening of the vault completed what had already been set in motion. None of these elements interfered with the others. They supported one another. Such alignment was rarely achieved without a central point from which it could be maintained. Whether that point existed in a single individual or was distributed among several remained uncertain, yet its presence was implied by the consistency of the result. Blackwood considered, for a moment, the possibility that the influence required had not been exercised directly within the bank at all, but had instead been applied from outside through knowledge acquired elsewhere. This would account for the coordination, though it would not fully explain the persistence of the discrepancies within the ledgers. External observation could reveal patterns, but it could not easily prevent their correction once noticed. The balance, then, inclined toward internal involvement. Not necessarily widespread, but sufficient. Someone within the structure had allowed the conditions to remain as they were, whether through intent or through a failure that had been carefully guided. The difference between the two was not yet clear, but the effect was the same. The guard had been placed in a position where his actions could be predicted. The records had been shaped in a manner that concealed the extent of what had been taken. The vault had been opened under conditions that removed the need for force. And all of it had occurred without interruption. Blackwood's attention returned briefly to the physical space of the bank, not to observe it anew, but to consider how little within it had resisted the sequence that had unfolded. There had been no sudden disruption, no visible struggle between opposing forces. Instead, the structure had yielded quietly, as though the path taken had already been prepared in advance. This, more than any single detail, defined the nature of the crime. It had not broken through resistance. It had moved within it, and in doing so, it had relied not on strength, but on the careful arrangement of conditions that made resistance unnecessary. The question that remained was no longer whether such an arrangement had been made, but who had been in a position to make it. And that question, once formed, pointed not outward, but deeper within the system itself. The structure of the bank, once considered as a whole, did not easily conceal the points at which control was exercised. While many moved within it, only a few shaped the manner in which it functioned, and fewer still maintained awareness of its operations beyond a single task or department. It was within this smaller group that the earlier observations began to take on a more defined direction. Blackwood's attention settled on the relationship between record and authority, not as separate elements, but as parts of a single process. The ledgers, though maintained by clerks, did not exist independently of review. Their entries were subject to periodic examination, and while such examination might not account for every detail, it was sufficient to identify irregularities that exceeded ordinary variation. That the discrepancies had remained unchallenged suggested that the process of review had not functioned as expected. This did not imply its absence, but rather its adjustment. An alteration need not be visible in order to be effective. It could occur in the timing of review, in the selection of what was examined more closely and what was allowed to pass, or in the quiet acceptance of figures that appeared consistent when viewed in isolation. Over time, such adjustments could create a condition in which inconsistency no longer drew attention, not because it had been eliminated, but because it had been absorbed into expectation. Blackwood considered how such a condition might be established. It would not require overt manipulation. A consistent delay in thorough examination, a reliance on summaries rather than detail, or a subtle shift in emphasis towards certain areas at the expense of others could produce the same result. These changes, if introduced gradually, would not appear as changes at all. They would become part of the routine. Routine, once established, was rarely questioned. This line of thought brought him to a quieter observation, one that had not been immediately apparent among the broader considerations of structure and design. The timing of the review itself. The discrepancies within the ledgers had not been discovered before the incident, but neither had they remained entirely hidden afterward. They existed in a state of partial recognition, acknowledged but not yet fully resolved. This suggested that the point at which a more thorough examination would normally have occurred had either been postponed or approached without sufficient depth. Such postponement could be incidental, yet in this case it aligned too closely with the timing of the event to be dismissed as coincidence. The vault had been opened at a moment when the uncertainty within the records was at its greatest, when the absence of precise accounting created a delay in understanding what had been taken. This delay, in turn, allowed the visible act of the crime to obscure the preparation that had preceded it. Blackwood allowed this alignment to guide his attention toward those responsible not only for oversight, but for its scheduling. The distinction was subtle but important. To review was one function. To determine when review occurred was another. Those who controlled the latter possessed a form of influence that extended beyond observation. By adjusting the timing, they could shape the conditions under which information was recognized, either bringing clarity forward or holding it back. Within the bank, this responsibility did not belong to the clerks. It rested higher. Blackwood's thoughts returned briefly to the internal rhythm of the institution, to the manner in which tasks were ordered and confirmed. The movement of documents, the verification of balances, and the progression from daily record to formal account all followed a sequence that, while routine, depended on direction. That direction did not manifest as constant instruction, but as a framework within which others operated. It was within this framework that the delay had occurred, not as a failure, but as a deviation that had been allowed to remain. This realization did not yet identify the individual responsible, but it clarified the nature of their position. They were not merely aware of the records, nor simply capable of influencing them. They occupied a role in which timing itself could be adjusted without drawing attention, where the absence of immediate resolution could be attributed to the complexity of the process rather than to intent. Such a role required both authority and familiarity. It also required presence. Blackwood considered the physical aspect of that presence, not only within the bank, but in relation to the street beyond it. The woman's appearances, though external, had been aligned with internal conditions. The moment at which the guard was drawn away coincided not only with his own pattern of behavior, but with the readiness of the final act to be carried out without interruption. This suggested coordination that extended across both spaces. The internal preparation and the external distraction had not operated independently. They had been synchronized. To achieve such synchronization required knowledge that moved freely between the two, a connection that allowed the state of one to inform the action of the other. Whether that connection existed within a single individual or through communication between several remained uncertain, yet its presence could no longer be ignored. Blackwood's attention returned once more to the timing of events, not as a sequence already understood, but as one that revealed its structure through alignment. The repetition of the woman's appearances, the accumulation of discrepancies within the ledgers, and the moment at which the vault had been opened all converged toward a single point. A point at which uncertainty was at its peak. And in that uncertainty, the crime had been completed. This was not the result of chance, nor of opportunity taken in haste. It was the result of a condition that had been created deliberately, sustained until it reached the precise moment at which it could be used. Blackwood did not yet know the hand that had shaped that condition, but he now understood where to look for it. Not in the act itself, nor in the distraction that had drawn attention away from it, but in the quiet control of time that had allowed both to occur exactly when they needed to. And within that control lay the first trace that could not be dismissed as incidental. The understanding that timing had been controlled did not remain an abstraction for long. Once considered within the structure of the bank, it began to suggest not only a function, but a position through which that function could be exercised without disruption. Blackwood's attention moved toward the point where record, oversight, and schedule converged. It was not enough to observe the ledgers, nor sufficient to confirm them. The critical element lay in determining when such confirmation took place, and under what conditions it was to be thorough rather than routine. Within the bank, this responsibility did not belong to many. The role that aligned most closely with these conditions was one that existed slightly apart from daily transactions, yet remained connected to all of them. It required awareness of the state of accounts without engaging in their constant maintenance, and it provided authority without the need for constant presence at a single desk. It was a position defined less by activity than by oversight, and by the expectation that its decisions would not be questioned without reason. Such a role often passed without particular notice. Its presence was assumed, its function accepted, and its influence felt more in the absence of disruption than in any visible action. It shaped the rhythm of the bank without appearing to do so, allowing processes to continue in a manner that seemed natural, even when small deviations had already begun to take hold. Blackwood considered how such a position might have been used. The gradual alteration of the ledgers did not require continuous attention from the same hand, but it did require that no correction be imposed once those alterations had been made. This could be achieved not by direct instruction, but by the adjustment of expectation. If discrepancies were regarded as minor, if their resolution was deferred in favor of more immediate concerns, then the conditions necessary for concealment would arise without overt interference. Over time, the absence of scrutiny became as significant as its presence would have been. This line of reasoning brought with it a second consideration, one that extended beyond the interior of the bank. The control of timing within the records had been matched by the precision of events on the street. The appearances of the woman, though external, had followed a pattern that aligned too closely with the internal state of the institution to be dismissed as coincidence. Such alignment required communication. Whether direct or indirect, there had to exist a means by which the readiness of one element informed the execution of the other. The moment at which the guard was drawn away had not been chosen at random. It had occurred when the conditions within the bank were most favorable, when the uncertainty within the records would delay recognition of what had been taken. This implied that those responsible for the external distraction had not acted independently. They had acted with knowledge. Blackwood considered the implications of this connection with care. If the coordination between inside and outside had been maintained through communication, then that communication must have been conducted in a manner that did not attract notice. It could not have been frequent, nor could it have relied on methods that would leave an obvious trace. It must have been simple, and it must have been sufficient. Within the routine of the bank, there were moments when individuals moved between its interior and the street without drawing attention. Deliveries, messages, and ordinary errands provided opportunities for brief contact that would not be remembered as significant. Such movements, repeated over time, could carry information without appearing to do so. Blackwood did not yet assign this role to any specific individual, but its presence within the structure was difficult to ignore. The connection between the internal preparation and the external execution required a point of passage, a means by which intention moved from one space to the other. Without such a passage, the alignment observed would have been far more difficult to achieve. The role that had first drawn his attention, the one defined by oversight and timing, now appeared in a different light. It did not merely allow the conditions within the bank to remain as they were. It also provided a position from which those conditions could be known in advance, anticipated, and, if necessary, communicated. This expanded its significance. What had seemed, at first, to be a matter of internal control now revealed itself as a point of connection between separate elements of the design. The influence exercised within the bank did not end at its walls. It extended outward, shaping the moment at which the external action would occur. Such extension suggested intention that was both deliberate and sustained. It also suggested that the individual occupying this position had not acted in isolation. Blackwood allowed this conclusion to form without pressing it further. The identification of a role did not yet amount to the identification of a person, and the distinction remained important. To move too quickly from one to the other risked overlooking the subtler details that might yet define the nature of the involvement more precisely. Still, the direction was no longer uncertain. The control of time within the bank, The persistence of discrepancies within the records and the coordination with events on the street all pointed toward a single point of influence. It was not hidden in the shadows, nor concealed through absence. It existed within the structure itself, operating in a manner so consistent that it had become indistinguishable from the routine it governed. And it was from that point that the design of the crime had most likely begun. The recognition of a role, once established, required a transition from structure to presence. It was no longer sufficient to consider how such influence might exist. It became necessary to observe where it resided and how it expressed itself within the ordinary movement of the bank. Blackwood's attention shifted accordingly, not toward what had been done, but toward who had been in a position to allow it. Within the daily rhythm of the institution, certain figures maintained a continuity that extended beyond individual tasks. They were not bound to a single desk, nor confined to a narrow function. Their movement carried them between departments, between records and decisions, between the mechanical and the administrative. They did not appear to intervene often, yet their presence defined the conditions under which others acted. It was within this presence that the earlier observations began to take form. The ledgers, though maintained by clerks, did not govern themselves. Their arrangement, their review, and the manner in which their irregularities were approached all reflected a direction that, while rarely stated, remained consistent over time. This direction did not emerge from those who recorded the entries, but from those who determined how those entries were understood. Blackwood considered how such determination might be recognized. It would not reveal itself through overt action. Instead, it would appear in the absence of correction, in the quiet acceptance of figures that might otherwise invite scrutiny, and in the subtle alignment of attention away from details that did not yet demand resolution. Over time, these small decisions would shape the perception of accuracy itself, defining what was considered complete and what could remain unresolved. Such influence was not easily distinguished from routine. It existed within it. This made its identification more difficult, but not impossible. Blackwood's attention moved to the pattern of review that had preceded the incident. The ledgers had not been examined with unusual frequency, nor had they been neglected entirely. Their state suggested a balance that had been maintained deliberately, one in which no single discrepancy was allowed to become prominent enough to demand immediate correction. This balance did not arise naturally. It required adjustment. The presence of such adjustment implied a consistent hand, one that guided the process without interrupting it. The individual responsible would not need to act often, but when they did, the effect would be sufficient to preserve the existing condition. This consideration led to a quieter observation. Those who held such influence were not merely aware of the records, but of the people who maintained them. They understood not only the structure of the system, but the behavior of those within it. They knew how much deviation would pass without question, how long a matter could be deferred, and when attention would naturally shift elsewhere. This knowledge extended beyond the ledgers. It included the guard. His schedule, though fixed within the broader rotation, was not entirely beyond adjustment. Small changes, made without emphasis, could alter the pattern of his presence without appearing significant. A shift exchanged, a duty reassigned, or a preference accommodated could produce the same effect while remaining within the bounds of routine. If such changes had occurred, they would not have been noted as unusual. They would have been accepted. Blackwood allowed this possibility to settle, considering how the repetition of the woman's appearances aligned with the guard's presence on those specific nights. The precision of that alignment suggested more than observation. It implied that the conditions had been shaped to ensure consistency, not merely anticipated. This introduced a further refinement. The individual at the center of the arrangement had not only allowed the discrepancies within the records to persist, but had also influenced the circumstances under which the final act would occur. The control of timing extended beyond the ledgers into the structure of the bank's operation itself. Such influence was not widely held. It belonged to those whose authority, though not always visible, remained effective in subtle ways. Their decisions did not require justification at every turn, and their familiarity with the institution allowed them to act without drawing attention. Blackwood did not yet name this individual, nor did he assign certainty to the conclusion forming around them. The evidence remained indirect, composed of patterns rather than declarations. Yet those patterns had begun to align with a consistency that could no longer be ignored. The control of review, the persistence of discrepancy, the alignment of schedule, and the coordination with events beyond the bank all pointed toward a single presence. It was not defined by action alone, but by the absence of interruption where interruption should have occurred. This presence did not conceal itself through distance. It remained close. So close, in fact, that it appeared indistinguishable from the structure it guided, its influence woven into the routine in such a way that it had not, until now, been separated from it. Blackwood's attention, having followed the structure to its source, now rested there with quiet certainty. The design of the crime had not emerged from the margins. It had been shaped from within, and the hand that shaped it had done so under the appearance of order, where deviation could be introduced without ever seeming to break it. The transition from structure to individual did not occur through sudden certainty, but through the gradual convergence of details that could no longer be separated from one another. What had previously existed as patterns within a system now began to align around a single point of presence, one that had remained indistinct only because it had been too closely integrated with the routine to invite scrutiny. Within the bank, there were few individuals whose roles combined oversight, continuity, and the authority to influence both without drawing attention. Among them, one position stood apart not by its visibility, but by the quiet consistency with which it connected the separate elements already considered. The management of accounts did not rest solely in the recording of figures, nor in their occasional review. It required an intermediary function, one that translated daily entries into a broader understanding of the bank's condition. This function operated between the clerks and the highest authority, ensuring that the movement of numbers retained coherence over time. It was a role that depended on trust. The individual who occupied it was not expected to question every entry, but to recognize when questioning was necessary. Their judgment, exercised sparingly, carried weight precisely because it was not constant. When they chose to intervene, it was assumed that their intervention was warranted. When they did not, their silence was taken as confirmation that all remained in order. Such a position offered more than responsibility. It offered discretion. Blackwood's attention settled on the manner in which this discretion had been exercised in the period leading up to the incident. The ledgers, though altered in subtle ways, had not provoked the response that might have been expected. Their inconsistencies had been allowed to persist, neither corrected nor brought forward with urgency. This allowance was not without origin. It reflected a judgment, whether deliberate or assumed, that the discrepancies did not require immediate resolution. Over time, such judgments accumulated, shaping the conditions under which the records were understood. What might have drawn attention in isolation became part of a broader pattern that no longer appeared irregular. The effect of this process was not to eliminate inconsistency, but to normalize it. Blackwood considered how such normalization might have been maintained. It required consistency of its own. The individual responsible for reviewing the records could not act sporadically in this regard. Their approach needed to remain stable, reinforcing the perception that the state of the ledgers fell within acceptable bounds. Any deviation from this pattern, particularly a sudden insistence on correction, would have disrupted the balance that had been established. This suggested that the same hand had been present throughout. Not necessarily in every entry, but in the interpretation of them. The connection to the events of the night now became more defined. The opening of the vault, conducted without force, implied not only access to the mechanism, but confidence in the condition of the records that would later be examined. Such confidence could not arise without knowledge of how those records would be received, and that knowledge belonged most naturally to the one who oversaw their interpretation. At the same time, The alignment of the guard's schedule with the appearances of the woman introduced an additional layer. The repetition required that the guard be present under specific conditions, and while his duties followed a general rotation, the precise arrangement of his shifts could be influenced in subtle ways. Such influence did not require direct authority over security. It required proximity to those who exercised it. Within the bank, communication between departments occurred as part of routine operation. Adjustments to schedules, accommodations of absence, and the resolution of minor conflicts all passed through informal channels that relied on familiarity rather than formal instruction. An individual position between functions, trusted by both, could move within these channels without attracting attention. This position, once identified in its full extent, brought with it a clearer outline of the person who occupied it. They were not distant from the daily work of the bank, nor were they confined to it. They moved between the recording of transactions and the confirmation of their accuracy, between the mechanical operation of the institution and the interpretation of its state. Their presence was constant enough to be unremarkable, and their decisions, when made, were accepted without question. Blackwood did not require a name to recognize the significance of this position. It had already begun to define itself through the alignment of the details it connected. The persistence of discrepancies within the ledgers, the absence of corrective action, the control of timing, and the coordination with events beyond the bank all converged upon it. Each element, considered separately, might have allowed for uncertainty. Together, they formed a structure that pointed with increasing clarity toward a single source of influence. This source had not acted openly. Its involvement had been expressed through absence, through the lack of intervention where intervention would have been expected. It had allowed the system to move along a path that appeared natural, while quietly ensuring that nothing occurred to disrupt that movement. Such a method did not draw attention to itself. It avoided it. Blackwood allowed this understanding to settle without forcing it into immediate conclusion. The identification of a role, even one so clearly defined, did not yet establish the full extent of involvement. It remained necessary to consider whether the position itself had been used deliberately or whether it had been guided by influence originating elsewhere. Yet the direction was no longer uncertain. The structure of the crime had narrowed to a point where abstraction could no longer contain it. It required presence, and that presence, though still unnamed, had already begun to take shape within the quiet operations of the bank. And it was there, within that shape, that the truth would begin to emerge. The movement toward certainty required more than alignment of thought. It required a point at which the structure, however carefully arranged, revealed a detail that could not be absorbed into routine. Such details were rarely prominent. More often, they appeared as slight inconsistencies, small enough to be overlooked, yet persistent enough to resist complete explanation. Blackwood's attention returned to the ledgers, not to their overall condition, but to the manner in which their irregularities had been distributed. The earlier observation had established that the discrepancies were neither random nor abrupt. They followed a pattern of gradual adjustment, each entry placed with care to preserve the appearance of balance. Yet within this pattern, there existed a subtle deviation. The adjustments, though consistent in their intent, did not maintain perfect continuity. There were moments where the alignment faltered, not in a way that disrupted the whole, but in a manner that suggested a brief interruption in the process. A figure that should have been shifted remained unchanged, while another, adjusted later, compensated for the difference. Such deviation might have passed unnoticed under ordinary conditions. Here, it acquired significance. It indicated that the hand responsible for the adjustments had not acted continuously. There had been a point at which the process had paused and then resumed, not from the exact position it had left, but from one slightly altered. This did not suggest error in the usual sense. It suggested constraint. Blackwood considered the nature of that constraint. It could not have arisen from the ledgers themselves, nor from the individuals who maintained them. Their work followed a routine that allowed for continuity, and any interruption would have been visible in a way that this was not. The deviation, subtle as it was, pointed instead to a moment where the process had been influenced by something external to it. Time, in this context, presented itself once more. The adjustments had not only been made carefully, they had been made at particular intervals, and those intervals corresponded not to the rhythm of the clerk's work, but to the rhythm of review. The points at which the pattern shifted aligned with moments when the records would have been examined, not in detail, but in summary. This alignment introduced a constraint that could not be ignored. The process of alteration had not been free to proceed without interruption. It had been shaped around the moments when scrutiny might occur, requiring the adjustments to pause, to wait, and then to resume once the opportunity returned. Such behavior did not belong to someone working independently of oversight. It belonged to someone working within it. Blackwood allowed this conclusion to extend further. If the adjustments had been structured around the timing of review, then the individual responsible must have possessed knowledge of that timing in advance. Not merely an awareness that review would occur, but an understanding of when it would be conducted, how thoroughly, and by whom. This knowledge did not circulate widely. It was held at the point where review itself was defined. The earlier identification of the role that connected oversight and timing now gained additional weight. It did not simply allow for the persistence of discrepancy. It governed the conditions under which that discrepancy could be introduced without consequence. The deviation within the ledgers, slight though it was, provided the first indication that this governance had not been abstract. It had been exercised. Blackwood's attention moved from the records to the broader sequence once more, tracing the path from preparation to execution. The interruption within the pattern suggested a moment where the process had encountered a boundary, one that required adjustment before it could continue. Such a boundary could only arise from within the system itself. It implied that the individual responsible for the alterations had not acted without awareness of oversight, but in relation to it. Their actions had been timed not to avoid scrutiny entirely, but to pass through it without detection. This required precision. It also required proximity. The distance between those who recorded the entries and those who reviewed them had been bridged not by chance, but by intention. The same hand that allowed discrepancies to persist had also guided the moment at which they could be safely introduced. The evidence, though still indirect, now carried a different weight. It was no longer composed solely of alignment, but of limitation. The pattern had not extended without interruption. It had bent, however slightly, at a point where control had been applied. And that control did not belong to the clerks. It belonged to the structure of review itself. Blackwood allowed his attention to rest there, not in haste, but with the quiet recognition that the boundary he had observed marked more than a moment of adjustment. It marked the presence of a guiding influence that could no longer be separated from the process it governed. The design of the crime had not only been precise, it had been constrained. And in that constraint lay the first indication that the one who shaped it had done so from within the very system that appeared to conceal it. The constraint observed within the ledgers did not stand alone for long. Once recognized, it began to align with other details that had, until now, remained separate, each suggestive on its own, yet incomplete without connection. What had been understood as preparation now approached definition. Blackwood's attention returned to the rhythm of the bank, not in its visible movement, but in the quieter structure that governed it. The timing of review, the persistence of discrepancy, and the coordination with events beyond the building all depended on a single condition. They required a point from which both knowledge and adjustment could be maintained without interruption. That point no longer remained abstract. It existed in the role already identified, but now it began to take on the weight of presence, defined not only by function, but by the consistency with which that function had been exercised. The individual who occupied it had not acted in isolation from the system, but through it, shaping its behavior without altering its appearance. This method, once understood, revealed its own logic. To alter the records directly would have been insufficient without ensuring that those alterations remained unchallenged. To delay review without preparation would have created suspicion. To open the vault without first shaping the conditions of what would be found inside it would have risked immediate exposure. Each element depended on the others, and each had been arranged with care. The gradual adjustment of the ledgers had reduced the clarity of what could later be identified as missing. The timing of review had ensured that this uncertainty remained unresolved at the critical moment. The alignment of the guard's schedule had created the opportunity for the final act, while the appearances of the woman had provided the means to remove him without force. Taken together, these elements formed not a sequence of events, but a structure. Within that structure, the role of oversight was no longer passive. It was central. Blackwood considered how such centrality would express itself in practice. It would not require constant action, nor would it depend on visible intervention. Instead, it would manifest through the absence of correction, through the quiet maintenance of conditions that allowed the plan to proceed without resistance. This absence, repeated over time, had created the space in which the crime could be completed. The individual responsible had not needed to act at every stage. Others, knowingly or not, had carried out parts of the process through their ordinary duties. The clerks had recorded entries as expected. The guard had maintained his post with reliability. Even the final removal of the contents from the vault had likely required hands that did not belong to the central figure. Yet none of these actions, taken alone, would have been sufficient. They required direction, not in the form of command, but in the arrangement of conditions that made each step possible. Blackwood allowed this understanding to settle, tracing the convergence of detail to its source. The deviations within the ledgers, the control of timing, and the alignment of events beyond the bank all pointed toward a single presence that had remained concealed not through distance, but through familiarity. It was not hidden. It had been overlooked. The individual at the center of the design had moved within the bank without attracting attention precisely because there had been no reason to notice them. Their role had required presence, but not prominence. Their decisions had shaped the institution, but had done so within the limits of expectation. This familiarity had provided the perfect concealment. Blackwood considered, then, the nature of the final act. The opening of the vault had been conducted with precision, but not necessarily by the one who had designed the sequence. The removal of the guard had been achieved through a method that relied on perception rather than force, suggesting the involvement of others who operated beyond the immediate structure of the bank. The central figure, therefore, had not needed to be present at that moment. Their work had already been done. This separation between design and execution clarified the nature of their involvement. They had not acted as a participant in the visible crime, but as its architect, establishing the conditions under which it could be carried out by others. Such a role required both foresight and restraint. It also required confidence that the structure would hold. The deviation within the ledgers, slight though it was, suggested that this confidence had not been absolute. There had been a moment, brief and contained, where the process had required adjustment. Yet that adjustment had not disrupted the overall design. It had been absorbed, corrected, and allowed to continue. This indicated control of a high order. Not perfection, but adaptability. Blackwood's attention returned once more to the role that had first drawn his focus, now no longer an abstraction, but a presence defined by its influence. The individual who occupied it had shaped the conditions of the crime from within the system that appeared to resist such manipulation. They had done so without altering its appearance. And in that, they had nearly succeeded in remaining unseen. The remaining question was no longer whether such a person existed. It was whether the structure they had created would withstand the moment at which it was fully recognized. For once that recognition occurred, the concealment provided by routine would no longer be sufficient, and what had been hidden within it would begin, inevitably, to emerge. The structure, once fully considered, no longer required assumption to sustain it. What had appeared as alignment now revealed itself as intention, and that intention, when traced through its necessary conditions, led to a conclusion that could not be deferred without ignoring the very pattern it had produced. Blackwood's attention settled on the role that had remained at the center of every convergence. It was no longer defined only by function, but by the consistency with which it had shaped the conditions required for the crime to occur. The individual who occupied it had not acted through sudden intervention, but through sustained influence, guiding the system in such a way that its own processes became the means of concealment. The ledgers, altered gradually over time, had been adjusted in a manner that preserved balance while obscuring loss. This required not only access, but judgment, the ability to determine how far a discrepancy could extend before it drew attention, and how it might be absorbed into expectation. Such judgment did not belong to those who recorded the entries, but to the one who interpreted them. The timing of review had followed the same principle. It had not been eliminated, but softened. Its thoroughness had been reduced just enough to allow irregularity to persist without challenge, while still maintaining the appearance of oversight. This balance, once established, ensured that the uncertainty within the records would reach its greatest extent at the precise moment when clarity was most needed. That moment had been chosen. The guard's presence, though part of a broader rotation, had been shaped to align with the final stage of the plan. Small adjustments, made without emphasis, had ensured that he would stand at the gate on the nights when the pattern of the woman's appearances was established, and again when it reached its conclusion. These adjustments did not require direct command, only influence exercised through routine channels, where preference and accommodation could be introduced without question. The woman herself had never been intended as an enigma to be solved. She had been a mechanism. Her appearances, consistent in time and form, had created a pattern that guided the guard's perception, drawing his attention gradually until it demanded action. The distance she maintained, the obscurity of her features, and the conditions under which she was seen had all been arranged to sustain ambiguity while encouraging pursuit. On the final night, that pursuit had been completed. The point at which the guard's memory failed corresponded not to chance, but to design. It marked the moment at which he had been separated from his post, not by force, but by influence applied with sufficient precision to remove both resistance and recollection. Whether this influence had been achieved through suggestion, through chemical means, or through a combination of both, it had been employed with the same care that defined the rest of the arrangement. Once the guard had been removed, the final act required no further complexity. The keys, taken without struggle, provided access to the vault. The removal of its contents, already prepared within the uncertainty of the records, proceeded without interruption. The door was closed again, not with exactness, but with sufficient care to avoid immediate notice, leaving behind only the smallest indication that it had been opened at all. The responsibility for these actions did not rest entirely with the central figure. Others had been involved, whether knowingly or not, in carrying out the physical aspects of the crime. Their role, however, had been limited to execution. The design, the timing, and the conditions that made execution possible had been established elsewhere. Blackwood's attention returned, finally, to the individual who had occupied that central position. Their presence within the bank had been constant, yet unremarkable. Their authority, though sufficient to influence, had not required display. Their familiarity with both the records and the routine had allowed them to move within the structure without drawing attention, shaping its behavior while appearing to follow it. It was this combination that had made the design possible. The oversight that should have revealed the discrepancies had instead concealed them. The authority that should have corrected irregularity had allowed it to persist. The knowledge that should have protected the institution had been used to guide its vulnerability to the exact point at which it could be exploited. In this, the identity of the individuals ceased to be uncertain. They were not defined by a single action, but by the totality of their influence. The one who determined when the records were examined, who allowed their inconsistencies to remain unresolved, and who possessed the familiarity required to align internal conditions with events beyond the bank could not be separated from the role that had made such alignment possible. The crime had not been committed against the structure of the bank. It had been committed through it, and the one who had made it possible had done so from a position where trust had replaced scrutiny and where routine had provided concealment more effective than any deliberate disguise. What had remained unseen was not hidden by darkness. It had been hidden by order. And once that order was understood, the presence within it could no longer be denied. The recognition of the structure brought with it a quiet resolution that did not require haste to unfold. Once the design had been understood, the elements within it no longer appeared uncertain, and what had previously seemed disconnected settled into place with a clarity that did not depend on sudden revelation. The guard remained where he had been, both in position and in circumstance, his account unchanged despite the weight of suspicion that had settled upon him. His memory offered no further detail, and the absence within it remained as complete as before. Yet what had once been regarded as a weakness in his explanation now appeared as its strongest support. The gap could not be shaped to fit the accusation. It could not be extended, altered, or adjusted to align with a version of events that required intention on his part. It remained fixed, resisting interpretation, and in that resistance lay its significance. It marked the boundary of his involvement not as concealment, but as interruption. The structure of the crime, once fully traced, provided the necessary context for that interruption. The guard had not acted independently, nor had he abandoned his post by choice. His actions had been guided toward a specific outcome, one that required his presence only up to a certain point and his absence thereafter. The loss of memory, rather than obscuring his responsibility, defined its limit. What had occurred beyond that limit belonged to others. The condition of the vault, the nature of the records, and the alignment of events all supported this conclusion. The access required to open the door had been obtained without struggle, and the removal of its contents had proceeded with a care that suggested preparation rather than impulse. The uncertainty within the ledgers, already established before the night of the incident, further removed the possibility that the act had been conceived or completed by the guard alone. In time, this understanding altered the direction of the inquiry. The weight that had first settled upon the guard began to shift, not through argument, but through the quiet accumulation of detail that no longer supported the original assumption. What had seemed sufficient at a distance proved incomplete when examined within the full context of the event. The simplicity of the accusation could not withstand the complexity of the design. Responsibility, once reassigned, did not reveal itself immediately in the form of confession or capture. The structure that had concealed it did not dissolve at once, nor did those who had participated in its execution present themselves openly. Yet the conditions that had allowed the crime to occur could no longer be maintained in the same way. The patterns within the records, once overlooked, began to invite closer examination. The timing of review, previously accepted without question, was no longer left unconsidered. What had been hidden within routine lost the protection that routine had provided. This change, though gradual, was sufficient. The central influence, once identified in its function, could not continue without drawing attention to itself. The same consistency that had allowed it to remain unseen now marked it with increasing clarity, and the absence of correction that had once concealed irregularity became, in itself, a form of evidence. It was not necessary for Blackwood to pursue the matter with urgency. The structure, having been revealed, would complete the work on its own. Within the bank, adjustments began to take place. The review of records became more exact, the movement of information more deliberate, and the quiet assumptions that had governed routine were replaced with a more careful attention to detail. These changes did not disrupt the outward appearance of the institution, but they altered its internal balance in a way that could not be reversed without consequence. In this altered state, the presence that had shaped the crime no longer fit as it once had. Its influence, once indistinguishable from the system, began to stand apart from it, defined not by what it controlled, but by what it had allowed to pass. The convergence of detail that had led to its recognition now extended beyond observation, forming a line that could be followed wherever it led. Whether that line ended in admission or in absence was of less importance than the fact that it could no longer be ignored. For the guard, the effect of this shift was quieter. The certainty that had been denied to him returned not as explanation, but as release. The suspicion that had surrounded him did not vanish at once, but it lost its foundation, and without that foundation it could not be sustained. His position, once defined by doubt, settled into something closer to what it had been before, though not entirely unchanged. There remained, in him, an awareness of the boundary his memory could not cross. The nights would continue as they always had, and the street would return to its familiar silence. The fog would gather and disperse according to its own pattern, no longer shaped by intention, but by the quiet movement of the city itself. And yet, within that silence, there would remain the knowledge that something had once passed through it with purpose. Blackwood did not remain to observe these changes in their entirety. His work, as it often did, concluded not with the complete resolution of every detail, but with the restoration of balance where it had been disturbed. The structure of the crime had been understood, the direction of responsibility had been corrected, and the conditions that had allowed it to occur had been altered. That was sufficient. As he left the bank, the street appeared as it had that morning, ordinary and composed, offering no visible sign of what had taken place within it. The distance between the entrance and the far end of the road remained unchanged, and the fog, when it returned, would do so without design, carrying no figure within it that demanded attention. What had been seen there had not belonged to the street. It had belonged to the plan. And with that plan now brought into the light, the street returned to what it had always been, a place of passage, unmarked by what had briefly given it form. In the quiet that followed, the matter did not end with a declaration, but with an absence. The absence of doubt. And in that absence, the truth remained, not as something revealed in a single moment, but as something that had, at last, been allowed to remain undisturbed.